Big show this hour. The top elections official in any state is usually called the Secretary of State. Now that can be a little bit confusing because at the federal level, the person who has the title Secretary of State is Hillary Clinton, and she's not at all in charge of elections. She's in charge of something totally different. But at the state level, the person who has that same title, Secretary of State, is usually the person who in that state is in charge of voting, in that charge of elections. Well, in the great state of Indiana, the Republican Secretary of State this year, a man named Charlie White, Indiana's top elections official, was convicted of 6 felonies this year, including voter fraud. Ow. Prosecutors said that Mr. White lied about his own address on his voter registration forms. He used his ex-wife's address instead of the address of a condo that he shared with his new fiancée because he wanted to hold on to a $1,000 a month gig that he had on the town council in the town where his ex-wife's house was, even after he had moved out of that district. The guy in charge of elections in the state of Indiana was found himself to have committed voter fraud. That is very embarrassing if that is your job, right? Also embarrassing, the fact that upon his conviction for voter fraud, Indiana's Republican governor, Mitch Daniels, refused to appoint a permanent replacement for him as Secretary of State because, hey, maybe Charlie White might be able to get those felonies busted down to misdemeanors on appeal, and then Charlie White could still serve as the state's top election official, despite himself being busted for voter fraud. Governor Mitch Daniels' hopes were never realized. Secretary of State Charlie White did get busted for felonies. He didn't get him busted down to misdemeanors. He was felony convicted. He was ultimately sentenced to a year of house arrest. And with 6 felony convictions, Charlie White did eventually get fired from his job running elections in the state of Indiana. And no, incidentally, Mitch Daniels is not now going to be vice president. Not with something like that dragging around behind him like a tin can tied to his bumper. But it was such a strange case, right? The top elections official in the state being tried and convicted and sentenced and thrown out of office for personally committing voter fraud. It's rare that you hear about real and not made up cases of voter fraud, but when it does happen, it tends to look like this. It tends to look like this pitiful Charlie White case in Indiana. It's weird. It's to no candidate's real benefit. It's a personal thing, and frankly, it's kind of pitiful. Here's another potential voter fraud case that fits that same description. Republican Thaddeus McCotter. He's been serving as a Michigan congressman for almost a decade. He might be done doing that now, because this year, Congressman McCotter's office failed to turn in enough valid petition signatures to even get him listed on the primary ballot to run for re-election to his own seat. Even if you're a long-time incumbent, you have to turn in between 1,000 and 2,000 signatures to get your name on the primary ballot in Michigan. And this year, of the nearly 2,000 signatures that Thaddeus McCotter's office turned in to get him on the ballot, only 244 of those signatures were found to be valid. The state's election director saying officials found an unprecedented level of obvious fraud in Thaddeus McCotter's signatures. Officials found identical petitions that had been photocopied, dates that were cut and pasted onto petition forms, badly cut and pasted onto the forms. In some cases, the petitions were just identical except for the name of the person who supposedly circulated the petition. They were just multiple sheets of the same signatures, as if each one was a new one. The state attorney general is now investigating this matter as a potential case of criminal fraud. Now, for his part, Congressman Thaddeus McCotter says he is totally on board with the whole criminal investigation thing because Mr. McCotter says that he is actually the victim here. He says, quote, somebody either panicked or it was sabotage. Thaddeus McCotter says, my gut tells me that we got lied to by someone we trusted. Thaddeus McCotter does not know how all those cut and pasted and photocopied signatures got onto his petitions, he says. But he says it looks like sabotage to him. And if that is true, you kind of feel for the guy, right? I mean, you even kind of feel for the Republican Party here. This was not a race where they thought they would have to spend a dime. This is supposed to be a safe Republican district with a long-time Republican incumbent congressman in it. They shouldn't have to spend a dime to defend this seat. But now, the Republican Party's choice is to either dump millions of dollars into that state race to try to save Thaddeus McCotter in what is statistically likely to be an unsuccessful write-in campaign to hold on to his own seat, or they can try to rally Republicans around this slightly eccentric reindeer herder who did actually manage to get himself on the ballot as a Republican, but who nobody had heard of before now. It's the wealthiest congressional district in Michigan. You guys ready to pick the reindeer herder for your congressman? We're going to have to wait and see what Michigan's Attorney General says in this case. But based on the look at the petitions that they've been made public, based on the assessment of state officials so far, based on what Thaddeus McCotter himself says about what this looks like it was election fraud. And as election fraud pretty much always is, like that bizarre Indiana case, it's rare, it's ham-handed, it's pitiful, and it's to nobody's real advantage, except maybe in this case to the reindeer guy who might get this seat. Election fraud happens really rarely, but once in a blue moon it does happen. Nobody disputes that. Except, of course, Republicans now say that voter fraud isn't some rare once-in-a-blue-moon thing. They say it is rampant. They say it is everywhere. They say it is hugely consequential. It is determining the outcome of elections regularly, and it is basically always committed by Democrats.
As you know, House Minority Leader John Boehner has made the call that we should end funding to ACORN and other groups that are engaged in what we believe to be voter fraud. What we want to do is have a thorough investigation. We want to look at stiffening penalties for these groups. Now, to say that ACORN is left-leaning is like saying Terry Bradshaw may be bald. The reality is that these people have a partisan agenda, and what it is doing is precluding the full operation and the integrity of the balloting process.
Congressman Thaddeus McCotter himself inveighing against the evils of widespread voter fraud back in 2008. We need investigations into all these left-leaning groups committing massive voter fraud to advance their partisan agendas to help the Democrats. It's rampant on the left. This is what Republicans say about voter fraud now. This is how Republicans talk about elections. Just today, Republican Party Chairman Reince Priebus raised the very scary specter of voter fraud in Republican Governor Scott Walker's upcoming recall election in Wisconsin.
I'm always concerned about voter fraud. I'm always concerned about it, which is why I think we need to do a point or two better than where we think we need to be to overcome it.
A point or two better. RNC Chairman Reince Priebus saying today that voter fraud is so bad on the Democratic side in Wisconsin that the Republican candidate needs to win there by a super extra big margin in order to compensate for all those fraudulent votes that will inevitably be cast for the Democrat. 1 or 2 points, he says, in a Wisconsin election. That means he's talking about something like tens of thousands of votes. Extra votes that the Republicans need to make up because of all the Democratic voter fraud in an election like this. He is that sure that there's that kind of rampant, one-sided voter fraud that it's going to decide the election if Republicans don't do something about it. And of course, Republicans are doing something about it all over the country. Where Republicans are in charge, they are working to make it harder to vote and harder to register to vote. According to the folks at the Brennan Center for Justice, Michael Waldman was here from that group last night. They're a nonpartisan organization that studies and promotes voting rights. According to the Brennan Center, at least 180 bills to restrict voting rights have been introduced in state legislatures since the beginning of last year. 180? 14 states have passed new restrictive voting laws that could have an impact on this year's 2012 election. These 14 states account for about 70% of the total electoral votes needed to win the presidency. Texas, Kansas, Wisconsin, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and Pennsylvania have all passed new requirements to show new documentation that you never had to show before in order to vote now. Documentation that hundreds of thousands of state residents do not have. There are new restrictions on early and absentee voting in Ohio and in West Virginia, in Tennessee, in Georgia, in Florida. What's the matter with early voting and absentee voting? Dunno, maybe it makes voting too easy, but these states are cracking down on it. They're rolling it back. There are new restrictions on voter registration in Texas, in Ohio, in Illinois, Florida. In the iconic swing state of Florida, the new voter registration and absentee voting restrictions aren't the only new obstacles to voting there this year. As we have been reporting on this show, Florida's Republican Governor Rick Scott has started a push to purge thousands of voters off Florida's voter registration rolls in time for the election. As in all these cases, the stated goal of this mass effort to take away thousands of Floridians' voting rights is supposedly the prevention of voter fraud. In recent weeks, the state of Florida has sent local elections officials a list of more than 2,600 registered voters who the state says are not U.S. citizens and therefore are not eligible to vote, and they have to have their names taken off the rolls. Election supervisors, in turn, have been looking at those lists and finding tons of inaccuracies. Like, for example, Maureen Russo, U.S. citizen, born in Akron, Ohio. The state of Florida wants her purged off the voting list. Bill in Turnicola, he's a 91-year-old World War II veteran. He's a U.S. citizen, born in Brooklyn, New York. The state of Florida wants him purged off the voter list. Or there's this guy, seen here posing with his American passport, as well as his local election supervisor, who is a Republican, but who does not want to purge this gentleman off the rolls, even though the state of Florida is telling him to. Even as local election supervisors from both parties have criticized whatever was the flawed process of putting voters' names on the state purge list this year, Florida state officials under Republican Governor Rick Scott are going ahead. They are vowing to ramp up the purge now. They are vowing to continue less than 6 months before the presidential election to take people's names off the voting rolls. A state elections official now telling the Miami Herald, quote, "I don't have a timetable on when the next list of names will be sent to supervisors, but there will be more names. There will be more names." The state of Florida will be targeting more of its voters for removal from the voting rolls. An analysis of the existing purge list already by the Miami Herald found that it disproportionately targets Hispanics and Democrats and independents to be purged off the Florida voter rolls. Do you think that pattern is going to continue as the state adds more names to the voter registration purge list? Or has it just been a coincidence that it has turned out that way so far? Joining us now is Judith Brown Dianis. She's a civil rights attorney and co-director of the Advancement Project. She represented the NAACP in a year 2000 lawsuit to remedy voting rights violations in Florida in that election year. Ms. Brown Dianis, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
You are much more deeply involved in the vagaries of Florida voting law than I am. Is there anything, did I get anything wrong in the way that I explained what's going on in Florida now in terms of how you understand the facts?
You got it right.
Okay. It's complicated and it's quickly changing, and a lot of this stuff hasn't been debated. It seems to be being done at the initiative of the administration of the Florida governor. Is the governor consulting with lawyers in order to? Is this the kind of thing that other states are doing? Is this a standard process that Florida is going through, or is this something unusual?
Well, I mean, it's Florida taking out their old bag of tricks, and they've come up with a new list, and the list is flawed. I mean, a 91-year-old World War II veteran. I mean, come on, really, Governor Scott? This is ridiculous. And we're finding that the list, not only is it flawed, but also the problem is that it shouldn't be done so close to an election. I mean, when we're changing the rules of how people participate in our democracy right before the election and doing it illegally and wrongfully, that's got to be stopped.
When you say illegally, I know that the Advancement Project, your organization, sent a letter to the Justice Department today, essentially saying that Florida is committing voting rights violations related to this purge here. What specifically are they doing what is illegal about what they're doing, and what do you want the Justice Department to do?
Right, so we've called on the Department of Justice because the list is about 60% Latino voters. And so while we know that the state of Florida has targeted black voters in the past, in 2000 and 2004, they also had a bad felon list that targeted black voters. This time, they've come for Latino voters. And so what we've said to the Department of Justice is it's time for you to step up, because the Department of Justice can just stop this dead in its tracks. And they can do that because the Voting Rights Act allows them to do that, because Latino voters are targeted. And so we've called on them to do it, but we've also called upon the state to stop the letters, to cease and desist with the purges, because we know that it's unlawful because it's too close to an election. The federal law says you cannot do these purges so close to an election. And why? Because we know that it's often done for partisan gain, and that's what we believe is happening now.
Think about the potential harm here, and even if the state of Florida sort of got nailed for doing this, if it was found to be illegal and the state of Florida got in trouble for doing it, if that happens after the election and a voter purge has a desired partisan effect on that election, I'm sure partisan elements in state government in Florida would be happy to pay that price as long as they got what they wanted out of the election. So if the Justice Department does not choose to intervene here, is there any other remedy to pursue before too much harm is done?
Sure. So we've called on the state to stop it, and we've given them notice, basically saying you're violating the law, and if you don't stop, the next step will be litigation. So if we have to litigate it, we will. And it's important to put this in the larger context, because basically what Florida is doing is they're taking one page out of the playbook of voter suppression that the Republican Party has done this year. You know, it's like, for them, it's like the left, right, and the uppercut, right? The uppercut is this purge, but before this, they made it harder to register, and they made it harder to vote by cutting back early voting. And so they're moving forward